Hey guys, so today we have a bit of an interesting video to get into here, and that is ranking every Survivor player voted out with an idol in their pocket. Now, this is a video that I had in the back burner for a while now, and it was a video that I was planning to make a couple months ago, but with shows like The Traitors and Australian Survivor coming out, it kind of got in the way of that. Though now seeing Survivor 46, a season that was quite unprecedented in terms of players being voted out with idols in their pocket, I feel like now is a great time to make this video, kind of looking at the entire history of this phenomenon and ranking the players where this happened to. So again, we'll be getting into that there. Now, before I get started, I guess I should clarify my criteria here. So for one, this is only looking at their games on the seasons in which they were voted out with idols in their pocket. This is not looking at them as players in general. And along with that, I should also clear up some weird circumstances that I won't be talking about. So I will only be looking at players voted out with hidden immunity idols in their possession. I will not be looking at players voted out with other advantages like vote steals and that sort of thing. And this goes for advantages that could evolve into idols but simply weren't. So cases like the amulets from 42 and 45. Also players voted out with a legacy advantage during rounds in which it was not an idol. So people like Sierra Dawn Thomas from Game Changers is a pretty notable example of that, as well as players with beware advantages that were not activated at the time they were voted out. So people like Brad from 41 will also not be included here. And along similar lines, I will not be looking at players voted out with expired idols in their pocket or idols that were simply not active at all. So people like Lauren Rimmer from HHH will not be included. And also people like Malcolm from Philippines who had an idol that expired at the Final 5 but was voted out Final 4. He will not be included here. And finally, I will not be including players who are medevaced or quit the game at the time in which they still had an idol in their possession. So people like Colton from One World, Neil from Co Wrong, Matthew from 44, and Brandon from 46. Those players will not be included as well. So with all those qualifications out of the way, that leaves us with 27 players to look at, and let's waste no more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 27, the player I believe played the worst game in this grouping of players is Garrett Adelstein from Survivor Cagayan. And Garrett is a pretty standard bad player, someone that is often regarded as one of the worst players in Survivor history. And while I personally wouldn't agree with that, I do feel like his game here is pretty bad. Now, I think the one pro you can give him is that early on, he was at least in the initial majority on his original Brains tribe, where he did seem to have the upper hand over David, and we do see him at that first tribal being able to take out David Sampson while having an idol there. But then he immediately gets flipped on the following round, and he doesn't play that well at all, where he tries to implement the buddy system during the second round by trying to get people to not talk game to him. And that causes Cass to flip on him. He is voted out 3-2 with the idol in his pocket. Again, it's a pretty bad game, all things considered. And while I did consider having him a little bit higher, considering he was in the majority for that first round, I feel like he played actively bad enough in that first round to where people do flip on him. And I feel like with that being pretty bad, I do have him here, number 27. Now moving on to number 26, and admittedly this player didn't play as actively bad compared to Garrett, but their game here is still mostly underwhelming, and that is Vince Moa from Survivor Island of the Idols. And Vince is another player that was voted out at the second opportunity. Now, he was in the majority for that first round where they took out Ronnie. Mind you, he was the minority target at that round anyway, so that's not particularly great. And he is seen as a bit of a physical weakness on his tribe, someone that didn't really click well with his tribe, but he still had people on his side, like Tom, for instance. Though even then, he does end up voting out Tom at the tribal that he goes out. Now, I think a big thing to bring up with Vince is his trip to IOI in his boot round, where through that he does get an idol that's only good for the next 2 rounds. And in some ways, that is a knock in the sense that he had fewer opportunities to play the idol, and yet still decided to not play it. But at the same time, I also think he was harmed by his trip to IOI to begin with, where due to that really caused people to get paranoid that he might have gotten an advantage there to where the majority ends up splitting their votes. But at the same time, he probably would have been voted out anyway had he gone to another tribal, even without the IOI visit. So I still think it's a mostly bad game, and the fact that he doesn't play his idol when he only had 2 opportunities to do so is pretty bad in my eyes. And I feel like even if he had played the idol successfully, he would have been in a bad spot moving forward regardless. But I feel like with him not playing as actively bad compared to Garrett, and with his IOI trip technically making him a bit unlucky in the game, I did decide to give him the edge, which is why he's here at number 26. Now moving on to number 25, and we have another pretty early boot, and that is John Rocker from San Juan del Sur. And I think John's game is a pretty weird one to assess, where obviously he came in as a pretty notable figure with him being a baseball player, and a pretty notorious figure as well with him being a bit controversial outside the game. So I feel like that definitely harmed him to a degree within the game as well, to where I feel like he was never really gonna do well in the season, where he was always going to be a target at some point down the road. Now within that, I don't think he plays particularly well. Now obviously a pro to give him over Vince and Garrett is that he does survive 2 tribals without being targeted. Now at that second tribal, he is sent to Exile Island, and he does build that bond with Jeremy and promises to protect Val, and is unsuccessful in doing so, largely because Val was telling people that she had an idol only for her to not actually have one, and at the point where she doesn't have one, that causes people to turn on her on the revote. And the fact that he ends up getting blamed for this afterwards, where from that point on, Jeremy is completely against him, as he saw John as breaking his promise, and we really see him become such a massive target after this point. And a lot of that stemmed from him not really being in that grave of spot to begin with. But despite this, he is still voted out with an idol in his pocket, which is obviously not great. And he's voted out despite him being a massive shield for people in the game, like people like Josh, for instance. So I feel like all in all, it's a pretty bad game where he doesn't really have that much agency within that. And even then, he's blamed for things that he didn't have as much of a direct hand in, like the Val boot, that eventually causes him to be taken out. And while I think he was harmed by his outside reputation, I felt like it also led to him never doing well in the season, which is a big reason why he is here at number 25. Now moving on to number 24, and we have another pre-merge boot to get into here, and our first returning player on the board, but we do have JT, and this is obviously his game from Survivor Game Changers. And JT's game is pretty rocky for the most part. Now, he is in a good spot on his initial tribe, though they never go to tribal. He does get a pretty bad swap where he is the only person from his original tribe to swap over. However, he still had some natural allies there, people like Sandra as a former winner, also people like Malcolm as someone he could have worked with. And again, he had some outs there, though the problem is that they end up going to that joint tribal, and you do have to blame JT for leaking his tribe's plans to Brad Culpepper. That causes Brad to play the idol, and he does end up losing Malcolm there, which I think is a massive blow to his position there. And then we get to the following round where he is targeted immediately afterwards. And despite him having an idol, and despite him very clearly being at the bottom of his tribe, he still does not play the idol there, which is obviously a pretty massive knock to his game. So obviously it's a pretty bad game, one in which he obviously does get a bad swap, but even within that, I don't think he plays particularly well. And I feel like moving forward, he probably would have been a target in the future, considering he was a former winner, which I feel like is a big reason why he is here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we are finally at the first new era player to talk about, and here we have Bruce from Survivor 45. And I talked about this before in my Survivor 45 player ranking, but I do think Bruce played a pretty bad game, especially with the hand that he was dealt, where he came into the season with a pretty massive advantage, with him being the only player that people had known from his appearance on 44, and people being willing to work with him coming into it. But he largely squanders that with how bad he is socially, where we see people like Katora and a decent amount of his tribe just being annoyed by him, to where he probably would have been the boot had his tribe ever gone to tribal in the pre-merge. That's pretty bad. We then get to the merge where his tribe completely fractures, and from that point on, he is essentially on the bottom. You even have people like Kelly targeting him, despite him feeling like he had a good relationship with Kelly, and through that, that's also pretty bad. He's also immune for a decent amount of his run, where he's really only immune for 2 rounds in the entire game, that being the Sifu round, where he's largely spared by Sifu being a more expendable number, and also Bruce having an idol to where it just was more convenient to take out Sifu at that point. And then you have his actual boot round, which came after he had won the last 2 immunity challenges in a row. And despite this being only the second time all season that he was vulnerable, and despite him very blatantly being at the bottom, he still gets tricked by Emily into not using his idol, and he is taken out there, which is pretty bad. So even now, I still think Bruce played a pretty bad game, and while he made it considerably further than certain other people will be talking about soon, that was largely due to challenge wins, where he was just immune for a decent amount of game, despite him being on the bottom for almost his entire run, and despite there being points where he was pretty unaware that he was at the bottom, and didn't realize that people he thought he was good with not really being on his side. And also the fact that he was tricked into not using his idol when he very well should have used it is pretty bad, to where he is here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and we actually have a person pretty similar to Bruce in my eyes, someone who did make it decently far, but a lot of that was due to challenge wins. Even then, they were largely at the bottom for a decent chunk of their run, and that person is Jason Siska from Survivor Micronesia. And I find Jason's game to be pretty similar to Bruce's, where he was essentially at the bottom for almost his entire run. But right off the bat, he's not really well positioned on the original fans tribe. He votes incorrectly at both the Mary and Mikey B tribals, voting out Chet there, only for Chet to not go home. Leading into the swap, where he is once again down in numbers, where the only person he really has as a number is Eliza, but even then they probably would have gone home had they ever gone the tribal. Leading into the merge, where he's once again on the bottom, where he probably would have been the merge boo had he not won immunity there, but even then, he loses Eliza, one of his closest allies. You also have him going to exile and thinking that the stick is a real idol, which is also a pretty bad look. And while he does vote correctly during the Aussie round, someone who we'll be talking about a bit later on this list, that's a situation where he had very little to do with the actual plan, where it was more so the Black Widow Brigade deciding that that was the time to strike at Aussie. And even then, Jason was a secondary target at that round to where he only survives in a 5-4 vote. That's also pretty bad. And then we get to his boot round where after Aussie's taken out with the idol in his pocket, he ends up finding the idol afterwards. And despite that, he is still taken out with the idol in his pocket. So all in all, it's a pretty bad game where Jason's on the bottom for pretty much his entire run. And despite him getting a couple rounds into the merge, I feel like that was largely due to him winning immunities early on. I also can't really imagine him winning a jury vote if he gets to the end, considering he seemed to be pretty disliked by a decent chunk of the cast as well. So really, I think Jason also played a pretty bad game. 2 worries here, number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have another person who made the merge, but I still find their game largely unimpressive, and here we have Chris Noble. And kind of similar to Bruce and Jason, Chris is someone who does get their way to the merge largely due to challenge wins, where his tribe ends up winning almost every immunity challenge with the exception of the Morgan round, but even then, he was sent to Ghost Island during that round, so even then, he doesn't even attend tribal until his actual boot round at the merge, which is pretty funny. But despite this, he's on the bottom for a decent chunk of his run, where after the first swap, he's pretty much on the bottom of both his first swap tribe and his second swap tribe, and it's possible that he would have gone home had he ever gone to those travels there. Now, I think a major pro to give Chris over the likes of Bruce and Jason is that he did seem to be in a good spot on his original Navidi tribe, where he was able to have essentially tied numbers with Dom and Wendell, which I find pretty impressive, and who knows what would have happened had they ever gone to tribal there, but they don't. And again, he's just kind of scraping on by to the merge due to him winning challenges, but then we get to the merge where he ends up going to Ghost Island and he ends up getting an idol that's only valid for the next 2 rounds. But despite this, and also losing his vote due to said challenge from Ghost Island, he still is blindsided by the majority of his tribe with the idol in his pocket. And this is also despite his rival in Dominic playing the legacy advantage at that round. So I feel like considering the circumstances, the fact that he doesn't play his idol here is really insane and a major knock to his game. Then also with him being on the bottom for a decent chunk of his run, I find it hard to have Chris too much higher than here. But again, the fact that he was at least part of a solid alliance early on in the game is more than I can say for either Bruce or Jason, who I feel like played similar enough games to where Chris is here at number 21. Now moving on to number 20, and we are now going back to the pre-merge here. And these next couple of players are all players who definitely have pretty bad games in the pre-merge, but I feel like there's some wonkiness that can explain why they end up being taken out with the idols in their pocket. But number 20, we probably have the least excusable of the bunch, and that person is Aubrey Bracco from Edge of Extinction. And Aubrey's tough, as I feel like she definitely had a major target on her back coming into the season due to her being a returning player, and with this cast being very anti-returnee. So I feel like that automatically put Aubrey on the bottom, and it did seem like that she would have been the first to go off of Kama had they ever gone the tribal, but they simply kept winning challenges. And then we get to the swap where she's pretty much swapped with her same group of people, plus Wendy as a potential number there. But despite this, she has both an extra vote and an idol there that she could have used to potentially shake things up, but instead she doesn't, where we see her getting tricked by Victoria into thinking that there's this women's alliance coming together to flip on Eric, and that causes her to not play either of her advantages, causing her to be taken out there. So I do have to give Aubrey a decent amount of fault here, where she should have recognized that she was clearly on the bottom of her tribe and that she probably would have been a potential target there. And despite that, she still decides to play neither of her advantages there, which is obviously pretty bad. The main reason I have her above some of the people we already talked about is I feel like she did less wrong to be on the bottom to begin with, where I feel like with those other players, a lot of the reason why they're at the bottom is due to their failure to build bonds with people. Whereas with Aubrey, I think a lot of the reason she was on the bottom to begin with is because she was a returning player and that she had this big target on her back, to to where it was probably less feasible for her to work her way off the bottom. So I don't really fault Aubrey as much for being on the bottom to begin with, but I still have to fault her for not recognizing that she should have used her advantages when she probably should have, to where she's here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we have another pre-merge boot to get into here, in the first of 5 players that we'll be talking about from Survivor 46, but we do have Gem. And Gem's another one who I think largely brought it upon herself by the end of it, where a big reason why she is taken out is due to her getting people to think that Tim had gotten the Beware advantage on her tribe. And obviously this is a move that she made in order to potentially put a target on Tim's back. However, it ended up doing the opposite, where instead it made people not want to target Tim out of fear that Tim would play his idol, and this in turn shifted the targets to be either her or Ben. And with Ben having the better relationships with people like Maria and Charlie, that caused Jen to be taken out here at the first tribal that she attends. It's obviously an incredibly flawed game where she almost brings her downfall entirely upon herself, where I feel like she would have been more successful in targeting Tim had she simply worked within her alliance to try to put the votes onto Tim instead of trying to make it seem as if Tim had already found the idol, especially with the way that she went about it, where she replanted the Beware Advantage note that she had found. And that could have opened things up for people to realize that there is no Beware Advantage to be found, considering she already had it. And obviously that could have caused people to recognize that she was lying. So again, I feel like Gem largely overplayed her hand here. But the main reason I have her above these other people is that she was at least in the majority alliance for more of her run. She was at least part of the initial majority on the Siga tribe. And while I think her downfall is a result of her own overplaying, I don't think it was necessarily as obvious as other cases of players overplaying, where she thought that by convincing people that Tim had the idol, that it would cause people to want to flush the idol by splitting the votes on Tim and Ben. And obviously, while she ended up being wrong by the end of it, I feel like it was less obvious that her play here would result in her being the boot. But I still feel like she would have been better off not making the play to begin with, so I do have to fault her for that. But considering those factors, I did have her a bit higher than the other pre-merge boots, which is why she is here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, and we're going back now to the post-merge, and these next 2 players are essentially figureheads for their alliance, where even though we did see them being a bit more out in front, I felt like they didn't have much agency in the game, and are also players that were vulnerable even earlier on. But we do have Eric Cardona from Survivor Samoa, and Eric's a weird case considering he was on the Glue tribe that only attended 1 tribal in the pre-merge, and even that was a pretty easy Yasmin vote. But Eric is someone who, despite him trying to galvanize the men on his tribe to take on the women on that tribe, I feel like he didn't really have much control within that group, to where I felt like the women were in better positioned compared to the men. And I felt like they would have probably won that battle had they attended more tribals in the pre-merge. And while he was definitely harmed by Russell Swan leaving the game, we then get to the merge where even people that he wanted to work with, people like Dave, people like John Fincher, all turn on him, to where he is taken out in a 10-2 vote, which is obviously pretty bad. So for the most part, I do find Eric's game here to be pretty underwhelming. I felt like he was a bit too overconfident in the game, someone who thought that his alliance of the men were going to steamroll, only for them to not really be loyal to that. And despite him making it to the merge, that was largely due to them winning challenges in the pre-merge, to where he only attends 2 tribals before his eventual boot. Nothing too much to praise about his game, which is why he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have a pretty similar figure to Eric in my eyes, though I feel like they were a bit more insulated, though even then they were still vulnerable at points. But we actually have Ozzy from Survivor Micronesia, who I did mention not too long ago. And admittedly, I find Ozzy's game also to be not that impressive. Now, he's technically within the majority for most of his run, where early on, he is part of that core alliance of Amanda, James, and Parvati, and they had the majority early on, where they end up taking out Johnny Fairplay after he quits the game, and then they get the outright majority the following round, taking out Yao-Man. But I think from the swap on, things get a bit more hairy, where despite him being in the majority initially on that swap group, we do see Tracy start to outplay him, to where it did seem at a point that he could have been blindsided in the pre-merge by Tracy, only for Chet to want to quit the game, causing Tracy to lose any leverage that she had there. So I feel like Ozzy gets incredibly lucky that Chet wanted to quit the game at that point that prevented his eventual blindside in the pre-merge. And despite him finding the idol, we also see him somehow being able to trick Jason into thinking that the stick is an idol there, which is pretty funny. And then after the merge, while he is part of that initial vote to take out Eliza, we then see his own core turn on him the following round, taking him out with the idol in his pocket. So in a lot of ways, I find Ozzy's game to be pretty underwhelming, where despite him voting the majority for most of the game, we also have his own alliance turning on him at the second round after the merge. And I feel like even within that alliance, I feel like people like Amanda, Parvati, and Suri had way more
influence in that group than Ozzy or James ever did. And I feel like that was largely reflected in that round where he's eventually flipped on and taken out the game. And considering he was also pretty cocky in the game, I feel like he was largely unaware that he was on the bottom and that it was really only a matter of time before he got flipped on within the game. So all in all, I feel like there's not too much to praise at the end of the day, which is why he's here number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have the final two players that were taken out in the pre-merge with idols in their pocket, and it's just a matter of ordering them. By number 16, I did decide to go with Sabaya from Survivor 45, and I think Sabaya got incredibly unlucky by ending up on Lulu, which ended up being this big disaster tribe early on, to the point where she had to literally throw her Beware advantage into the fire at Tribal Council in order to get her idol, which I find really funny there. But Sabaya was very much the leader of the Lulu tribe early on, where she was very much in the center of things. She was going to take out Emily at that first round, only for Hannah Rose to quit the game. After that, she is part of the majority to take out Brandon at the next round. And then we get to her boot round, where admittedly I do think she does some wrong here in wanting to turn on Caleb, which felt pretty misguided in my eyes, where even though Caleb would have been this massive threat down the road, as we see after the merge, Caleb was someone who was still willing to work with her down the road and would have been the shield for her in the game. Not to mention that she was banking on Emily's vote for this plan to go through, which, considering that Emily was clearly on the bottom early on and she had built this bond with Caleb, felt very misguided there. And then you had Sabaya not even voting at this tribal, where she ended up foregoing her vote in order to extend the life of her idol, and then she doesn't even play it, resulting in her being taken out with the idol in her pocket. So kind of similar to Gem, I feel like this is a case of Sabaya bringing it upon herself, where through her decision to target Caleb in a spot where Caleb had this closer bond with Emily, it just felt like a plan destined to fail, not to mention that she could have saved herself here only to not do so. But the main reason I have her this high in the list is that she did have control on our initial tribe. She did seem to be the decision maker for those first two tribals, not to mention that with Lulu being as bad of a tribe as they are, I feel like she did get unlucky that she ended up on a tribe like Lulu to begin with. So I feel like those things definitely prop her up on the ranking, but at the end of the day, she is still only the third boot of the season, and she still brought it upon herself, which is why she's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have the highest ranked pre-merge boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Chelsea Walker from Island of the Idols. And I think Chelsea is a pretty interesting player in the sense that she was part of the initial majority alliance on Lyro, and she is part of the majority for those first two votes, taking out Ronnie and then voting out Vince, who we talked about earlier in this video, before she's blindsided herself due to a very strange circumstance. Now on the show, it does highlight that she was aligned with Dean and there was this perceived showance between them. However, that wasn't actually the reason why she went home, where it turns out that a big reason why she goes home is because Missy wanted to make this big move right before the swap for no real reason other than just to make a big move. And with the show not really having any footage to explain the rationale for Missy's move here, and with it being so last minute, they had to cobble together the storyline about Chelsea and Dean having the showmance, and you had to break them up just to explain it to the audience. So it's actually a very strange circumstance over why she goes home here. And while you can knock Chelsea for not having that bond with Missy to where Missy will want to keep her around, I don't really fault Chelsea that much for it, and I don't think she does that much wrong to be voted out, where I feel like at the end of the day, a lot of it was just Missy wanting to make a move just for the sake of making a move. So I feel like to that end, if we are comparing her to all the other pre-merge boots voted out with idols in their pocket, I don't think Chelsea did as much wrong to be booted in the spot that she has, and that's a big reason why I have her the highest ranked of the pre-merge boots. But at the end of the day, she is still only the fourth boot of the season, and even though I did debate putting her higher, I feel like 15 is a decent spot to put her. Now moving on to number 14, and from this point on, every single person left may be merge, and it's just a matter of ordering them. Though number 14, I actually consider putting this person lower, as I talked pretty negatively about this person in the player ranking, but we do have the second player from Survivor 46, and that is Venus. And I'm actually pretty surprised that Venus ended up being this high on the list, as truth be told, I did actually consider putting her lower, kind of similar to where I put the likes of Bruce and Jason from earlier on, as despite her making the merge, she is very rarely in the majority alliance, and she's someone that very rarely has much agency within the game. But I think a major thing elevating her on this list, at least relatively speaking, is that compared to the likes of Bruce and Jason, she was relatively safe for a decent chunk of the game, despite her not being in that great of a spot. Now, yes, on the original Nami, she did seem to be in danger at a point with her being a very blatant outsider. However, we do see her later building a bond with Randon, the other outsider who managed to find the Beware advantage, and had Randon not been medevac, there is a shot that they could have made a move down the road, though truth be told, it wouldn't shock me if Venus ruined their plans anyway with how bad she is socially. But I think another thing is that had they gone the tribal later on in the pre-merge, I don't think she goes home, as it did seem like Soda was becoming a much bigger target at that point, and she probably would have been safe for that first tribal had they gone to it, though who knows beyond if they went to a second tribal. However, I do think the early merge is where she is in a bit of danger, where at the mergatory vote, she is the secondary target, with the likes of Mariah and Ben wanting to target her, though, again, Mariah was more of a consensus target there. We then get to the split tribal, where she is the secondary target there as well, and she's largely saved by Tevin wanting to make a move against Soda, which again shows that she probably would have stayed over Soda, despite it not even being in Tevin's best interest to be keeping Venus around, so I feel like that's something to point out, though at the same time, it is funny how Venus later claims that this was her move when it was really just Tevin's. We see her being part of the majority of the next couple rounds, with her being the secondary target during the Tevin round, though she's able to survive that. She's also part of the vote split plan at the final 9 to take out Hunter, who we'll be talking about a bit later, though she is later blindsided at the final 8, where she is not included in the Tiffany plan, who is another person we'll be talking about soon, and then she is taken out herself at the final 7, almost immediately after finding an idol herself, and I feel like she plays that boot round pretty terribly, where she tries to bring Charlie to her side only to sketch him out, and I feel like with her not telling more people about her idol, it really causes the likes of Charlie and Maria to not really trust her, despite her wanting to keep the idol around for a future round. So I feel like for the most part, she kind of screws the pooch there. So in a lot of ways, I feel like Venus's game is pretty bad. And again, I am surprised she is relatively high on this list, though considering that she does survive more tribals in positions where she was voting the majority, I feel like that was at least enough to have her above the likes of Bruce and Jason, people that either were immune for a decent amount of the runs or people that were blindsided in multiple opportunities when they did attend tribal. So I feel like those minor pros were just enough to have Venus above those other people, though realistically, I can't have her any higher than number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have another person who made it somewhat deep into the game, but I find their run here mostly underwhelming, and here we have Nasir from Survivor 41, and I find Nasir's game mostly underwhelming as well, where despite him technically being part of the majority for a decent amount of his run, he's also never really in that strong of a position. We're on the original Luvu, he does seem pretty close to the Danny and the Sean side, however I feel like those two have more agency there than Nasir does. We also have him having a bit of a rivalry with the likes of Sydney that would have played out had they gone the tribal, though I feel like he would have gotten his way had they gone the tribal in the pre-merge, where it did seem like they were on board to take out Sydney had they gone the tribal later on in the pre-merge, so that's something at least. We then get the Mergatory, where he is part of the plan to take out Sydney, however, that vote was just kind of all over the place, and there was a lot of wonky circumstances that led to Sydney being taken out, but he does get his way there, and then he's part of the majority for the next round, being aligned with the other Luvus, plus Shan and Ricard, with him being a clear number for Shan there, taking out Tiffany. But then we get to the split tribal, where he's essentially taken out by his own alliance, where at that point, the likes of Erica, Heather, and Ricard turn on him. And while I could say that he was screwed over by not having Evie or Xander on his tribe, someone that could have kept that group together, I also think that the Ricard, Erica, and Heather contingent was already planning to turn on Shan not too long afterwards, and by taking out Nasir, it really enables them to pull the trigger on Shan at the final 8, which we'll be talking about later in this video. But I feel like Nasir is taken out as collateral damage, which also speaks to how expendable he is within the game. And I feel like Nasir is someone who probably struggles to get towards the end and win the game, where he's pretty blatantly on the outskirts of the majority alliance, and even had they gone down together, Shan probably would have cut him along the way, and even if he got to the end, I feel like he would have struggled to win in certain scenarios, so even then I don't think it's a guarantee that he wins. So in a lot of ways, I find Nasir's game to be not that great at the end of the day, where even though he was technically within the majority for a decent amount of his run, he never seemed that well positioned within it, and I feel like his boot is largely a reflection of him being this expendable number to be taken out to propel the bigger players in making moves down the road, which kind of leaves him here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and this player is someone I tossed around a bit. I wasn't entirely sure what to make of this person's game, as I feel like there are elements of this person's game that I find somewhat impressive, though by the end they are unable to put it together, and that is Brendan from Survivor Tokensheens. And Brendan's game is kind of weird, where early on he is part of the majority on his Tambira tribe, where he's part of the majority during both the Candace and Jerry rounds. He also has a very close relationship with Sierra, who was perceived as being on the bottom of their tribe. And we also see him being sent to exile multiple times. That allows him to build bonds with the other tribe, with people like Taj and Steven. And we even see them building an exile alliance to where, had that stuck together, that could have put Brendan in an interesting spot come the merge. And we see him coming to the merge with these connections. The problem is that I feel like Coach and Tyson kind of outplay him to where later on the pre-merge, it did seem like the Coach and Tyson side had more control over their tribe than the Brendan and Sierra side, which isn't particularly great. Then also, Brendan kind of just lets go of his relationships to Taj and Steven. That makes it so that the Jalapals end up siding with Coach and Tyson over Brendan and Sierra, which is really bad, and obviously leads to him being taken out at the first tribal after the merge with the idol in his pocket, which is obviously not particularly great. I'm kind of conflicted over Brendan's game, as had he been able to keep that exile alliance together and had he done more work to ensure the Jalapals' loyalty come the merge, I feel like Brendan and Sierra could have taken the majority from that point on. The problem is that he just kind of lets go of the gas and allows Coach and Tyson to align more with JT and Steven. So I feel like that's a pretty big knock to Brendan's game, but I feel like the fact that he had at least some interesting ideas during the pre-merge kind of leaves him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have yet another player from Survivor 46, but we do have Hunter McKnight. And I did consider putting Hunter a bit higher, considering he essentially dominated his pre-merge tribe along with Tevin, where it did seem like they were very much in the center of things. However, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that they're never tested. And I think considering what ends up happening after the merge, I do have to knock that against them, as had they gone to tribal in the pre-merge, their plan was to take out Soda there, and considering that that would have left Liz as the swing vote had they gone back to tribal, I could see a world where Liz flips over to the other side and potentially takes out the likes of Hunter or Tevin. Now, is that a guarantee? I'm not entirely sure, but the fact that that was their plan, and considering that I think that was pretty suboptimal, especially with Soda being pretty willing to work with them, I do have to take that into at least some consideration. I also think Hunter struggled a lot with threat management over the season, where even during the pre-merge, we had people like Venus talking about how he's a big threat, and we even get to the merge, where despite him being part of the initial majority that takes out Mariah, by the split tribal the very next round, we already have Tin Spicer, someone who's supposed to be in the +1 alliance with him, already thinking about taking out Hunter for being this big physical threat and someone that could win all the challenges. And while he's able to survive that, we literally see his ally in Tevin pulling the trigger on Soda on the other side of things. That makes it so that the very next round, Liz does flip on them, and he's on the outs during that Tevin round, loses his closest ally, and then he's the target the very next round, where he even recognizes that he could be in some danger, but at the same time, he keeps on trying to find ways to not play his idol. He gets a bit too cute about it, and he's so focused on trying to find ways to get through the round without playing his idol that he just ends up not playing it, which is pretty ridiculous in my eyes. So in a lot of ways, I find Hunter's game here not too impressive, where even though he technically dominated the pre-merge tribe, I think a lot of that was because they never actually got to execute their plan of taking out Soda. And the fact that Hunter is immediately put on the outs the round after they actually go through with that plan is pretty bad in my eyes. His actual boot round, where he decides not to play his idol when he knew he was in danger, is also pretty bad. And also, even if he had played his idol, even if he had gone through that round, he still would have been a massive threat in the future to where he probably would have needed to win out. And while I would have had more confidence in Hunter to pull that off compared to a lot of other players in Survivor history, it's still an unreliable way of getting through the game, so I also have to knock him for that. It's a game that has some ups and downs, but I do have to leave it here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we actually have another person from Survivor 46, but we do have Q. And obviously Q does outlast Hunter by a couple rounds, but despite this, he still does pretty actively bad work in blowing up his game after the merge. Now early on, he is in a solid spot on the original Yanu tribe. Mind you, he thinks he's in the center of it and felt like he was closer to Tiffany than Kenzie was, which wasn't exactly the case, but he is part of the majority early on, taking out a lot of the outsiders. He does get pretty unlucky that they had to vote out Banu, though considering it was Banu, he didn't really have much choice there. He does create the +1 alliance before the merge, which could have had some impact in the game, only for it to crumble pretty quickly, with him even voting out Tin Spicer at only the second tribal after that alliance was formed. He ends up blowing up his game at the final 10 by wanting to quit the game and also trying to target Tiffany when Tiffany didn't want to target Venus there, which isn't great. And he's mostly just kept around the next couple rounds as a smokescreen to lull the bigger threats into a false sense of security, only for them to be taken out instead, only for him to eventually be taken out the final 6 with an idol in his pocket, literally the first round after he found it. And he explains afterwards that the main reason that he didn't play was that he was so confident that had he just held on to it for one more round, that he probably would have gotten to the end and won, which, sure, I guess. It's a pretty messy game and one that I still have a lot of trouble really assessing. However, the main reason that I don't fault Q more than some other people will is that he was at least part of the majority for a decent amount of the pre-merge, and even after he blows up his game, he's still kind of able to recover by the end of it, with him aligning with Maria, though I think that was also because Maria saw him as a GOAT, considering he has 0 win equity by the end of it, despite what he said afterwards in his exit interview. Again, it's a pretty tough game, but I figured this was a decent spot to land him, so he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and in a lot of ways, I think this person's game is actually more similar to Hunter's than it is to Q's. However, I feel like there's more wonky circumstances that explain their non-play during their boot round, but we do have Scott Pollard from Survivor Co. Wrong, and I feel like there are a lot of similarities between Scott and Hunter, as I feel like they're both pretty dominant figures on their original tribes, but kind of lose control after the merge. Where early on, Scott is in a good spot on the original Braun tribe, where he's working alongside Kyle Jason and Sydney. They blindside Darnell at their first tribal, and then pick off the other outsiders in Jennifer and Alicia. Though at the same time, I don't think he treats Alicia particularly well, to where Alicia does target him during that round, but again, he's clearly in the majority there. After the swap, he does remain in the majority, picks up Ty, and they vote out Anna and Peter. Not too much difficulty there, though then after the merge is where things get a bit more wonky. Now, I do think he gets a bit unlucky that Neil gets medevac, where it did seem like the initial plan coming to that merge round was to take out either Aubrey or Neil, who did have an idol at that point, though obviously Neil gets medevac, so that kind of erases that round. But then the following round, the actual first round of the merge, he is blindsided there, where the women come together and they take out Nick. That's not particularly great. After that, he's not included on the eventual Debbie blindside, and we even see Debbie targeting him at that round, which is not particularly great either. And then we get to his boot round, where Aubrey straight out outplays him, where Aubrey is able to flip over Ty, someone who was on his side initially, to take him out there. And I think this is where things get a bit more wonky, as he is taken out with an idol in his pocket. However, the main reason he doesn't play his idol there was that he was expecting Ty to combine his idol in order to form a god idol that could have been used after the votes are read. And while Scott was expecting the votes to come his way, he did not anticipate Ty to flip at that point, and obviously that's a big reason why he was taken out, to where had he known that Ty was not on his side, he probably would have played his idol at that point. So it is bad in the sense that Scott didn't recognize that Ty had flipped against him, though at the same time I feel like he had an out there in terms of actually playing his idol had he known that Ty was not on his side, then that he would not have combined the idol there, where he knew the votes were coming his way and that he was playing to stir the votes his way in order to create this blindside here. And to be fair, even if he did play the regular idol after Ty had flipped, the plan still wouldn't have worked, considering it would have been a tied vote between Aubrey and Ty probably goes out on the revote, which is a bit unfortunate. So I'm not saying Scott played a particularly great game here, and I feel like even if he had survived this round, I don't see him as a particularly likely winner, considering it still would have only been the final 7, and he was clearly in the minority at that point. And I don't think he treated certain people well along the way, but I still find some merit to Scott's game here. And even with his decision not play his idol, I think there's enough wonkiness within that decision that kind of leaves him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and that person is Kelly Kim from Survivor Island of the Idols. And Kelly's a really tough player to assess. Obviously, she was very much impacted by the Dan Spilo situation, and obviously that played a factor during the round where she was taken out. However, I do think she played a pretty solid game up until her boot, where early on she was on the majority on the original Vokai tribe. She's a key figure in the Molly blindside. After that, she gets a pretty beneficial swap where she's able to take out Tom Laidlaw, and she's also able to connect with Dean, someone who she had an out of the game connection with. And we see that play out the last round before the merge, where we do see her blindsiding Jack by using her idol to save Dean, while at the same time putting her vote onto Dean to mask her loyalty. And this is a plan that could have propelled her game moving forward. The problem is that Nora leaks the plan immediately afterwards, which causes her to become a pretty big target after the merge, which is obviously pretty unfortunate, though at the same time she was also being very much weighed down by the Dan Spilo situation, to where she and the minority end up targeting Dan in order to remove a toxic presence from the game. And obviously that's pretty understandable. The problem is that the majority doesn't really get on her side and they take her out anyway, which is obviously pretty unfortunate. Though at the same time, I think another thing to bring up is that she's taken out with 2 idols in her pocket, which is obviously a bigger knock than a lot of other players we already talked about up to this point, including people that went out with idols that were about to expire. Where had Kelly played one of her idols at this tribal, she still would have had another one down the road that she could have used later to save herself and possibly surprise people that were not expecting her to have another idol so soon. So I do think Kelly's decision to not play her idol during her boot round is obviously worse than a lot of other players we already talked about. Though at the same time, I feel like her game up to that point was pretty strong. I do think she gets pretty unlucky not only by the Dan Spilo situation that causes her to lower her guard, but also with Nora leaking her involvement with the Jack blindside that she had made just the previous round. And while she needed Nora for that plan to go through, it's still unlucky that she had to rely on someone like Nora to get that plan to go through. But I still find Kelly's game here mostly impressive despite her mistake of not playing one of her idols, which is why she's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I did consider putting this person lower if I'm being honest, as even though this person was technically part of the majority for most of their run, they were never really in the core of things and were also being targeted at certain points. But number 8, I did decide to go with Andrea from Survivor Kara Moen, the first woman to ever be voted out with an idol in her pocket. And I find Andrea's game here mostly fine, where early on she's part of the majority alliance, she's part of the Francesca plan at the first round. After that, she doesn't really attend tribal again until the merge, unless you want to count the Brandon round where they forfeit immunity and immediately vote him out, but that's not really much of anything. Out of the merge, she is taking out a lot of the outsiders, people like Corinne, Michael Snow, and the Three Amigos, but despite this, she's still being targeted by the Three Amigos during a lot of those rounds, where she is the minority target during the Michael round, as well as the Malcolm round, where they even went to a 3-way tie due to the majority splitting their votes, which is obviously a pretty precarious spot there. And then while she takes out Reynolds the following round, she's then immediately blindsided at the final 7 with the idol in her pocket. And I kind of debate this one, as I feel like in a lot of ways she didn't really have much of an end game by the end of it, to where it didn't seem like she was in the core of the majority, and even if she had survived this round, I'm not sure how she gets to the end unless she wins out, and even then, like, who knows who she beats at the end. So I do find Andrea's game here to not be that great at the end of the day, if I'm being honest, but I feel like compared to other people we talked about in similar positions, I feel like she doesn't play as bad as someone like Venus, and I feel like she's someone who wasn't as expendable as someone like Nasir, though at the end of the day, I find her game to not be that great if I'm being honest, but still she has longevity on the season, and she is in the majority for most of her run, which leaves her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the OG player that was voted out with the idol in their pocket, and that is James from Survivor China. And I kind of struggled with where to put James, as his non-play is known now as one of the dumbest moves in Survivor history, considering he had 2 idols in his pocket at the time of the final 7, to where had he played one of them, he would have been guaranteed a spot in the final 5, to where he would have only needed to win 2 challenges to get to the end. And obviously that's pretty bad, all things considered. However, I feel like his game outside of that isn't the worst in the world. Now, early on, he is part of the majority alliance. He is aligned with the likes of Todd, Amanda, and Courtney. He does take out Leslie at that first tribal. Again, all that's pretty good. But then he gets massively screwed over by the Tride swap on this season, where the tribes got to handpick who they got to bring over, and we see the other tribe in Jonghu basically poach Aaron and James due to them being the strongest physical guys on their tribe there. And then we see Jamie and Paige throw in the next immunity challenge, checking out Aaron there. And obviously James is on the bottom to where the plan was to take him out next, only for his original tribe to want to save him, where he is kidnapped the following round after the reward challenge, to where he's handed Fei Long's idol and is told where to get the one on the other camp. He's able to get back to the other camp, and he's able to grab the second idol, essentially handing him the 2 idols that he has for the rest of his run. And we even see him wanting to go along with throwing the next immunity challenge, hoping to use one of the idols there to take out the likes of PG or Jamie, only for Denise to suck more on the gross food eating challenge. So again, doesn't quite go through, though it does allow him to enter the merge with both idols there. And with his tribe up in numbers, that basically puts him in a spot to where they can steamroll the next couple of rounds, taking out a lot of the outsiders one by one, though he was also the minority target at the final 9, the John Robert round, and we actually see Todd consider pulling the trigger on James at that point, though he doesn't exactly go through with it. And he's able to get to the final 7, where he still has both idols at that point, to where he could have played both of them to guarantee a spot in the final 5. Had he won immunity at the final 7, he could have then used both idols then to secure a spot in the final 4, to where he would have been pretty close to the end game, obviously pretty close to getting to final tribal. It's just a question of whether he can win. And I think against Denise and Courtney, he would have a pretty good shot there. Though I think against the other people by the final 7, it would have been pretty tough for him to beat like a Todd or a PG. Though, again, it's not impossible for him to win there. Though by that point, we do see Todd and Amanda snipe him out with both the idols in his pocket. And the fact that he doesn't play either of them is pretty bad. Then also he votes for PG at this tribal, who was trying to flip the game on Todd, which is also not great, as I feel like Todd and Amanda were always going to cut him down the road anyway. So even then, I feel like he doesn't play well within that round regardless. So at the end of the day, I feel like James's game is mostly fine where he is part of the majority for most of his run. However, he was never really in the core of the majority group. And while he had a path to get towards the end, I very much question whether he would have made the moves necessary to ensure his win, where we see him trying to vote out PG at the final 7, despite PG trying to flip the game against the core power structure, and he was pretty happy sticking in the game with Todd and Amanda up to that point, which I feel like would have been a pretty losing position for him by the end of it. So again, mixing that in with the fact that he was blindsided with both the idols in his pocket, that kind of leave him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I would essentially consider this the top tier of the list, as I feel like these top 5 all played pretty good games for the most part, even though they have some issues along the way, with one of them being the fact that they were taken out with the idol in their pocket. But we do have John Mish from Survivor San Juan del Sur, and I think John played a fine game as well, though I think there's some rockiness within that. Now early on, he's part of the majority alliance on his original Hunapu tribe. They don't go to tribal for those first couple rounds. However, things kind of go downhill during the Drew Christie round, where he kind of has his hands tied after Drew makes himself a pariah among the women, to where the women turn on him. That kind of leaves John in a bad spot, though they swap immediately afterwards, where he's reunited with Jacqueline, his loved one, and they're able to be in a power position on that tribe, taking out both of the Wentworths. And that really extends into the merge, where John and Jacqueline become these power players in the game that are essentially able to ride the middle between the two sides, and they're able to take out the leaders of both sides, taking out Josh at the first vote, and then flip again the next round to take out Jeremy. But then we get to the final 9, which is pretty bad for John, where we do see Reed picking up the scraps and attempting to lead this coup to blindside John with the idol in his pocket. And it seemed for a while that this plan was going to go through, only for Keith to leak it in the middle of tribal, which is a pretty lucky break for John, though even then, he still doesn't believe it, even after being told that there was this other plan, to where Natalie and Jacqueline have to tell him to play his idol in order to actually survive that round, which is pretty bad on John's end. And while they're able to reassert control at the final 8, taking out Reed, we then get to the final 7, where he's blindsided at the Alec round, where the plan was to take out Keith, only for Natalie to flip her vote to take out Alec instead. And then we get to the final 6, where Natalie, Keith, Baylor, and Missy team up to take out John with the idol in his pocket, which is all pretty bad there. So I am kind of conflicted on John's game as a whole, where on one hand, I look at him as being like this figurehead for his alliance that dominated a decent chunk of the game, and I feel like that middle stretch of the game is pretty good for him. Though at the same time, there are some pretty big knocks to his game as well, like the Drew Christie round early on. You got the final 9, where he basically has to be told what to do there, and then him getting blindsided at the final 7. Again, all these are pretty big knocks, but when we're comparing John to these other players who, for the most part, have not played particularly strong games, I think John's game kind of stands out from the rest of the pack, and that kind of leaves him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the highest ranked Survivor 46 player to get into, and we do have Tiffany. And I largely view Tiffany's game as a cleaner version of John's, where even though she became a target around the same time as John while being taken out a couple rounds earlier, I do feel like she had control for more sections of the game than John and had fewer bumpy roads, where early on she was essentially in the center of the Yanu tribe, where it seemed like she was really in the middle of everything, and she was probably the safest person on that tribe, to where she never goes home in any situation. And we see her taking out a lot of the outsiders along the way, people like Jelinski, Jess, and Banu, and had they gone into tribal again, she would have been the swing vote there, having to decide between Kenzie and Q. That's all pretty good. We later see her being pulled into the +1 alliance along with Q. That seemed like it could have done well after the merge, though obviously that kind of crumbles by the end of it. Though she does remain the majority at the split tribal, taking out Tim at that point. But then we get to the final 10, where from that point on, she does become a pretty big target in the game, where even Q, one of her closest allies by that point, is the one throwing out her name after she refuses to target Venus in that round, which is pretty insane, though she's able to avoid that. We then get to the final 9, where people are once again considering taking her out. And while she does stay there, you also have her telling people that she's going to play her idol no matter what and get it out of the game, only for her to not do so there. And then we get to the final 8 where she's once again being targeted by people like Kenzie and Maria, and this time they do pull the trigger, taking out with the idol in her pocket, and the fact that she knew that the idol was a big concern, she doesn't play it anyway, is all pretty bad. So again, I don't think her endgame is particularly good, where she was being targeted for the last 3 rounds that she was in the game, and even if she had played her idol and even if she had survived, I feel like she would have continued to be a target moving forward, to where I can't really see her having much of an endgame because of that. But I still feel like she played probably one of the more dominant games of this grouping, to where she had full control over the pre-merge, is able to survive multiple tribals there, and is able to remain in a good position for more of the game than someone like a John. But at the end of the day, she was still taken out around the final 8, and she was someone who, even though she was in a good position for a lot of the game, still became too big of a threat by the end of it, to where she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this was tough, as I really debated these next 2 in particular, as I feel like both of them play pretty strong games for the most part, though obviously have their faults along the way. And truth be told, I feel like one of these players is closer to that of Tiffany compared to the person I will be having here at number 3. But I feel like this person, number 3, just simply had no path to the actual end by the end of it, though we do have Kelly Wentworth, and this is her game from Edge of Extinction. And the tough thing about Wentworth is she had no path to the end, where she came into the season with such a massive target on her back, obviously due to her being this returning player, and she's able to avoid that for most of the game. She's able to avoid that better than pretty much every other returning player on this season. Now, granted, she's targeted for a lot of her run, where we do see her receiving votes at a decent amount of tribals that she attends, though despite this, she's able to remain in a solid spot despite this. Where early on, she is part of the majority on her original Manu tribe, and despite them attending the first 3 tribals, and despite her name being tossed around as a potential target, she's able to keep her core of War Dog and Lauren together to get through a lot of those early votes. And while I think she gets lucky at the Chris round, where Devins and David decide to keep her, thinking that a swap is coming in order to keep their tribe unified, she's still able to survive that round, and then after the swap, when it's essentially the same group over again, she's still in the majority, taking out Devins at the next round. Probably would have taken out David had they ever gone to tribal again. But then we get to the merge, where admittedly the merge round is pretty bad, where we see her tribe essentially going against each other rather than trying to stick together, and that really hands all the power to the commas, and she very well could have been taken out that round, only for the commas to take out Joe for being a bigger threat among the returning players, which is pretty lucky on Wentworth's end. But then we get to the following round, where her core group essentially become the swing votes, where at that point we see the commas turning on each other, and we see them becoming power brokers that are able to decide the next couple of votes, taking out Eric at the final 12, Julia at the final 11, and then we later see her flipping against David, who was one of her bigger oppositions at the final 10. And the fact that she was able to keep this core together during these rounds is pretty impressive on Wentworth's end. But then we get to the final 9, where War Dog flips on her, taking her out with the idol in her pocket. And I think that ties into one of her bigger flaws in her game, where while she was able to have a lot of agency over the course of the season, and while she was able to avoid being taken out despite her being targeted at multiple points, I think she was always going to be taken out at some point before the end, as War Dog was always seeing her as a meat shield to be taken deeper into the game, and at the point where she gets taken at the final 9, that was the point where War Dog decided to flip on her. Now, granted, I think War Dog flipped on her too early, as we literally see War Dog being taken at the very next round, which is obviously a knock against Wentworth, as she couldn't convince War Dog to keep her around for the amount of time that it would have been optimal for him to do so, but at the same time, it was a 5-4 vote, that's something at least. And I felt like Lauren was someone who was still pretty loyal to her at that point in the game. And with her having the amount of agency that she had for so much of the game, despite her being this massive target, is a massive pro in my eyes, and a big reason why she is this high on the list. But I feel like the top 2 players have more pros to their game, and either had more dominance in the game compared to Wentworth, were targeted not as often as Wentworth, or had a clearer path to the end than Wentworth by the end of it, to where she's only here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this is someone who I was debating with along with Wentworth. However, I feel like this person's game was slightly more dominant than Wentworth's, and this person was targeted less than Wentworth, but we do have the highest one-time player left on the board to talk about, and that is Shan from Survivor 41. And I think Shan played an outright dominant game up until her boot round, where early on she is in the center of the Uwa tribe, where she has relationships with everyone, and we see her literally being safe during the entire pre-merge, despite her tribe attending multiple tribals and getting all the way down to 2. Where even at that final 3 tribal between her, Genie, and Ricard, she is the swing vote there to where Genie and Ricard are voting for each other. Obviously, she ends up siding with Ricard there, getting to the merge with him. We then get to the merge where she's in a power position there, really having multiple alliances that she can move with moving forward, where for one, she's aligned with the other Luvus and picking up the other Yases, but she's also aligned with the other black players in Ricard, Danny, and Deshawn that could have elevated her in the game. And this really allows her to be in the majority for the next couple of rounds, picking off a lot of the outsiders along the way. But then we get to the split tribal of the final 10, where I do think she makes a questionable decision here, where we do see her agreeing to use her extra vote to split the votes on Nasir and Heather, and to blindside Nasir on the revote, taking out Nasir with the idol in his pocket, someone who we talked about earlier in this video. And I think taking on Nasir in this round was a massive mistake for Shan, as Nasir was pretty clearly a number for Shan moving forward. And I think this really enables the likes of Erica, Ricard, Heather, and Xander to flip the game against her at the final 8. And we see her being genuinely blindsided here, where she is taken out in this round, and she doesn't even know that Ricard was the one behind this move, which is obviously pretty bad there. So in a lot of ways, I do feel like Shan did more wrong to bring about her boot, where I feel like by voting out Nasir really gave the other side ammunition to flip the game against her at the final 8. And truth be told, even if she had kept Nasir in the game, I feel like she probably would have been picked off anyway due to her being a very blatant threat by the end of it. But I feel like compared to a lot of these other players, I feel like she played an outright dominant game. And I feel like she was targeted less for more of a run compared to someone like Wentworth. So I think for those reasons, it's pretty clear that Shan is indeed one of the best players to be taken out with the idol in their pocket. But I feel like there's one player that's even better than them, which is a big reason why she's here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the player I believe played the best game in which they were taken out with the idol in their pocket is Sophie from Survivor Winners at War. And I think Sophie played a pretty impressive game on the season, despite her only being 10th place, where she was really in the power position for so much of her run. And I feel like compared to the other players on this list, I feel like she did less wrong to be taken out during her boot round here, where early on she's in a pretty strong spot on her original Tikal tribe, being pretty close to Yule and Sarah, and we see her being in a power position during those early votes, taking out Kim and Tyson before the swap. We see her maintain control after the swap, where she takes out Boston Rob, and then we get to the merge, where she is essentially the best position player in the game, where she has ties to so many people within the majority alliance, and we see her being in a good spot, taking out a lot of the outsiders in Wendell and Adam. They take out Tyson at the final 10, and it very much felt like she would have been in a spot to get towards the end of the game in a powerful position, where it very much felt like the only person that could have stopped her from controlling the game was Tony, who does pull the trigger on her at the final 9. However, I feel like the level of difficulty that it took Tony to blindside her at the point where she was very high, where we really see Tony pulling in a lot of these people like Jeremy, to blindside Sophie in a plurality vote at the final 9. At really one of the last opportunities that he could have made a move like this, where he would have had the numbers to do so. And I can't really fault Sophie as much for not playing her idol in the spot where she was taken out, considering the level of difficulty involved in the actual blindside, where it's not even like the people in the outs were the ones leading the charge here. It was Tony, someone who was still within our power structure, but someone who was not in the center of that power structure. And we really see Tony wanting to take out Sophie as a way of getting closer to Sarah. So I feel like Sophie's downfall here was not as predictable than it was for so many other players in the game, where I feel like so many other players either made more mistakes than someone like Sophie, or someone who probably should have anticipated their boot more than Sophie. But I feel like Sophie was someone who was so primed to continue to dominate the game moving forward, and the fact that she was taken out here is something that she probably could not have anticipated as much as so many other players on this list. And I feel like with the amount of control that she had for a lot of the game, while still having prospects moving forward, is what easily makes her the best player in this grouping, which is why she's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again with more Survivor videos down the road, so you can look forward to that. I'm on Patreon and have a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, feel free to click the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.